The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded 3 times and stained at one corner with what Theodora Sutton suspected was river water, and it told her that her brother was dead, and that she now owned 40 acres of land she had never seen in a territory she had never visited. She stood in the narrow kitchen of the boarding house where she had worked for the past 4 years, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers not from grief alone, but from the sheer weight of what the words meant. Her brother Edmund had been 29 years old. He had gone west in 1879, the same year the Kansas Pacific was pushing hard through the plains, and he had written her faithfully every month until 7 months ago when the letters had simply stopped. She had told herself he was busy. She had told herself the mail routes were unreliable. She had told herself a great many things that now turned to ash in her mouth as she read the words written by a county clerk in Hays County, Texas, informing her that one Edmund Sutton had died of a fever in late September of 1882, and that per the deed of property he had registered with the county office, all 40 acres located along the creek-fed land south of the town of Calla Springs were hereby to pass to his next of kin, being one Miss Theodora Sutton of Abilene, Kansas. She was 24 years old. She had $40 saved, a carpet bag, and a bone-deep loneliness that had been her companion for so long she had nearly made peace with it. Edmund had been her only family left after their parents died of cholera in 1877. Now he was gone too, and somewhere south of her was a piece of land that bore his name in the county ledger, and her name on a deed she had not yet held in her hands. She gave her notice at the boarding house the next morning. The journey from Abilene to Calla Springs took 11 days. She rode the Kansas Pacific south and east as far as she could, then transferred to a stagecoach that smelled of leather and tobacco, and the particular anxiety of people moving through open country that did not belong to them. The Texas Panhandle in the spring of 1883 was a landscape that demanded something from a person, something she could not name but felt in her chest each time she looked out the dusty window at the endless roll of grass and sky. There was a beauty to it that frightened her a little. Edmund had loved it. She understood now. He had described it in his letters as a place where a man could breathe all the way down to his boots. She had thought at the time that was a strange thing to say. Now, watching the light fall golden and enormous across the plains, she understood exactly what he meant. Calla Springs was not much of a town by any measure. It had a main street with a general store, a saloon, a smithy, a small church painted white that was already beginning to peel in the relentless Texas sun, a post office that was also a barber shop, and a county clerk's office wedged between a harness shop and a feed store. There was a hotel of sorts, which was really just the upper floor of the general store converted into 4 rooms with thin walls and a shared wash basin at the end of the hall. Theodora took a room, set her carpet bag on the narrow bed, and sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap, allowing herself 60 seconds of grief before she stood back up and went to find out exactly what she had inherited. The county clerk was a thin man named Mr. Peavy, who wore spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, and who regarded Theodora with the mild suspicion that men in official positions sometimes reserved for women who arrived alone and asked questions with authority. She produced her letter, her own identification papers, and a copy of a letter Edmund had sent her 2 years prior in which he mentioned her by full name as his sister and only living kin. Mr. Peavy looked at the documents for a long time, seemed to find nothing to argue with, and grudgingly produced the original deed. The land was 42 acres, slightly more than the letter had stated, and it ran along the eastern bank of a creek called Garner Creek. There was a house on the property, described in the deed as a timber frame dwelling with 1 chimney, and there was a barn. Edmund had paid for the land outright in cash in the summer of 1880, which told Theodora that her brother had worked very hard in the year after he arrived in Texas. She was proud of him in a way that made her throat tighten. What Mr. Peavy told her next, delivered in the tone of a man reporting a minor administrative complication, stopped her cold. "There's a fellow been working that land since your brother passed," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Name of Brenner, Roscoe Brenner. He came in about 2 weeks after your brother died and asked about the status of the property. I told him it was going to next of kin. He said he understood and that he'd keep things in order until whoever that was showed up." Mr. Peavy paused. "That was 7 months ago." Theodora stared at him. "He has been farming my land for 7 months. More like maintaining it. Keeping the animals fed, the fences mended, the winter wheat planted. I believe he put in some early spring work as well." Mr. Peavy folded his hands on the desk. "I don't know what arrangement he had with your brother, if any. He never made any claim on the property, never asked for payment, just said he'd keep it up." Theodora walked out of that office into the warm April afternoon with a great deal more to think about than she had walked in with. She borrowed a horse from the livery stable, a steady bay mare with patient eyes, and followed the directions Mr. Peavy had drawn on a scrap of paper. The road south of town was rutted from recent rains and then baked hard by the sun that followed, so that the ground had a cracked, determined look to it, like something that had been tested and had refused to break. She rode for about 3 miles before she crested a low rise and saw the land spread out below her. It was more beautiful than she had expected. The creek ran bright and silver through the eastern edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves were just coming in, pale green and trembling in the afternoon breeze. The house was small but solid-looking, built of good timber with a covered porch running along the front. The barn was larger than the house and painted a dark red that had faded somewhat but still held color. There were fields, and they were not wild or choked with weeds. They were worked. There were rows of something green pushing up through dark soil, and the fence lines she could see from the rise were straight and intact. Someone had taken care of this place. Someone was taking care of it right now, in fact. She could see a figure down near the barn, moving with the purposeful, unhurried stride of a person who knew exactly what they were doing and where they needed to be. She rode down. He heard the horse before he saw the rider, and he turned from the fence post he had been examining, hammer still in hand, and looked up at her with dark eyes that held no particular alarm, only the steady, evaluating gaze of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had learned to read the landscape in all its forms. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simply, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was shaded with several days of stubble. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who worked with them constantly, calloused and capable. He looked at her with the question in his face and not yet in his voice, and she appreciated that. She had dealt with enough men who spoke before they thought. "I'm looking for Roscoe Brenner," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was a low, unhurried thing, with a Texas drawl that was not thick but was present, like a river current that ran deep under still water. "My name is Theodora Sutton," she said. "Edmund Sutton was my brother. I believe you have been working his land." Something moved across his face then, something she could not quite read. It was not guilt. It was not surprise, exactly. It was more like recognition, the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and has finally seen it arrive. He set the hammer down on the fence post with a careful, deliberate motion. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said quietly. She dismounted and stood facing him in the warm afternoon light. "Then you know this land belongs to me now." "I do," he said. "I knew it from the day Edmund died." He paused, and she watched him choose his words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground, with care and attention. "I want you to know that I made no claim on this property and had no intention of doing so. I've kept records of everything I've done here, what was planted when, what the animals are, what the fences needed. It's all written down. I can give it to you whenever you're ready." She studied him. The late afternoon sun was at her back and fell full on his face, and she could see that he meant every word. There was an openness in his expression that was not the openness of a man who had nothing to hide so much as the openness of a man who had decided some time ago that honesty was simply easier than its alternative. "Why did you do it?" she asked. He looked at the land for a moment before he looked back at her. "Edmund was a good man," he said. "He was my neighbor. My land is about a mile east of here. When he got sick, I helped him where I could. He told me near the end that he had a sister back in Kansas and that he had never sent for her because he wanted to have something worth sending for first." He stopped for a moment. "He died before he could do that, and I thought someone should make sure there was still something worth arriving to." Theodora did not say anything for what felt like a long time. The cottonwood trees whispered along the creek, and somewhere in the barn a horse stamped and settled. "He never told me about you," she said at last. "He never mentioned a neighbor named Brenner." "We didn't know each other long," Roscoe said. 6 months, maybe 7. But out here, 6 months with the right person can mean more than years somewhere else. She understood that. She understood it more than she expected to. "I would like to see the house," she said. He walked with her to the porch and opened the front door and stood back to let her enter first. The inside was clean and spare. There was a table, 2 chairs, a cook stove, a shelf of supplies. There was a bed in the back room with a folded quilt on it. There were Edmund's things still on the shelf by the window, a shaving brush, a small tin box, a folded map of Texas with pencil marks on it. She touched the tin box and did not open it, not yet. "I've been sleeping in the barn," Roscoe said from the doorway. "When I needed to stay overnight to tend to things, I didn't want to disturb what was here." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed, watching her with that careful, patient expression. "You slept in the barn," she said. "Yes, ma'am, for 7 months. Not every night, just when something needed watching. A calf that was having a difficult birth, a fence section that needed mending before the rain got to it. Things that couldn't wait." She sat down in one of the chairs and looked at the table and then back at him. "Mr. Brenner," she said, "I don't quite know what to make of you." He offered her the faintest suggestion of a smile, the kind that came and went quickly, as though he was not entirely sure it was welcome. "That's all right," he said. "You just got here. You don't have to make anything of me yet." She stayed that first night in the house, and Roscoe went back to his own land, which was, as he had said, about a mile east along a well-worn trail. Before he left, he showed her where the lamp oil was kept, where the well rope had a tendency to stick, and where Edmund had stored the winter supplies that remained. He showed her all of this with the manner of a man giving a tour of someone else's home, careful not to imply ownership in any word or gesture, and she appreciated the precision of it. After he rode away, she sat on the porch in the blue evening and looked at the land that was hers, and tried to feel something about it beyond the dull bewilderment that had settled over her since she'd first read the county clerk's letter. She had expected to arrive here and find neglect, perhaps squatters, perhaps a fight with some man who thought a woman alone could be persuaded to surrender a deed. She had not expected this. She had not expected the planted fields and the mended fences and the records kept in a stranger's handwriting for 7 months out of pure, uncomplicated decency. She went inside and opened the tin box. Inside was a letter. It was addressed to her. Edmund had written it in what was clearly a difficult hand, the pen shaking slightly, the letters formed with the effort of a man who was fighting for the energy to write. It was dated the 21st of September, 1882, which the county clerk had told her was 4 days before Edmund died. "Theodora," he had written, "if you are reading this, then I did not make it, and I am sorry. I am sorry that I did not write for these last months when I was sick, because I wanted to spare you the worry and I was too proud to tell you I needed help. I should have sent for you. I should have done a great many things differently. But I need you to know that this land is good land, and it will take care of you if you let it. There is a man named Roscoe Brenner who farms the land to the east. I have asked him to look after things until you arrive. He is the best kind of man I know of, quiet and honest and hardworking without needing anyone to notice. Trust him. He knows this country and he will help you learn it. I love you, Theo. I always loved you more than I was ever good at saying. Come to Texas. It is a place where a person can breathe all the way down to their boots. She folded the letter and held it against her chest in the dark and cried for her brother for a long time, the kind of crying that is not weak but necessary, the kind that clears the ground for what must come after. In the morning, she got up and went to work. She did not know how to farm, not really. She had kept a kitchen garden at the boarding house, and she understood basic principles. But the 42 acres that Edmund had acquired were a different matter entirely. The winter wheat that Roscoe had planted was coming in well, but it would need attention she was not entirely certain how to give it. There were 2 horses, 4 cattle including a young calf that had clearly been born recently, a dozen chickens, and a hog that regarded her with what she could only describe as professional skepticism. The cook stove needed a new gasket or it drew poorly. The well rope had stuck exactly as Roscoe had warned her it would. The porch step on the left side was soft, and she made a mental note to deal with it before someone went through it. She made a list. She had always been a list maker, a habit her mother had considered unfeminine and which she had stubbornly maintained. Roscoe appeared shortly before noon, riding the same steady route across the eastern field. He carried a covered pot that turned out to contain a beef stew and a small round of bread wrapped in cloth, and he left them on the porch railing without ceremony, saying he thought she might be too occupied to have cooked a proper meal yet. Then he asked, with careful politeness, whether she would like him to show her the state of the wheat or whether she would prefer to assess things on her own first. She asked him to show her. They walked the fields in the warm noon light, and he explained what had been planted and when and what it would need, using plain and patient language with no condescension in it, as though he simply assumed she was capable of understanding and was only giving her information she needed. She asked questions, and he answered them without making her feel foolish for asking. She told him about the cook stove, and he said he thought he had a spare gasket on his own property and would bring it by. She told him about the porch step, and he looked at it and said he could have it fixed within an hour if she wanted. She said she did want, and he pulled a hatchet from the saddlebag he had carried over and set to work that same afternoon. This was how it began between them, with a stew left on a porch railing and a soft step replaced, and a man who asked without assuming, and a woman who accepted without owing. It was a practical beginning, but then, the best things often were. Theodora spent the first 2 weeks learning her land with the fierce concentration she applied to everything. She was not a person who accepted confusion as a permanent state. She read the notes Roscoe had kept, which were thorough and organized in a way that surprised her, and then stopped surprising her because she had already come to understand that thoroughness was simply how he operated. She walked every fence line herself. She introduced herself to the horses, whom Edmund had named July and August, which she thought was exactly the kind of thing Edmund would do, and she introduced herself to the hog, who she named Margaret simply because she felt like it. Roscoe came by most days. There was always a legitimate reason, a question about the wheat, a replacement part he had located, a calf that needed checking, but she began to notice that the legitimate reasons were sometimes quite thin, and that after the thin legitimate reason had been addressed, he did not always leave immediately. He would linger on the porch, hat in his hands, and they would talk, not about farming, about Edmund sometimes and the stories that filled in the spaces between the letters she had saved. About Kansas, which he had never been to but which she described with the precise affection of someone who loved a place and had left it anyway. About Texas, which he had been born in and which he spoke of with the particular love of a person who knows something's flaws and loves it fully anyway. She learned that he was 28 years old, 4 years older than she was. He had been born near San Antonio and had moved north to Hays County 3 years ago to work land of his own after spending his 20s doing seasonal work for various ranches across the state. He had no family to speak of, a father who had died when he was 14 and a mother who had remarried and moved to Louisiana, whom he wrote to occasionally but had not seen in 5 years. He had no wife, had never been married, and when she asked him why, the question coming out before she fully decided to ask it, he looked at her sideways with that quiet expression and said that he had never met a woman who made him want to stop moving long enough to stay. She asked him, several days later, whether he was still moving. He looked at the fields and then at her and said that he had not been feeling particularly inclined to move lately. She felt heat rise in her face and turned to look at the creek so he would not see it, and she heard the smallest sound from him that might have been amusement and might have been something else entirely. The town of Calla Springs received Theodora Sutton with mixed feelings, which she had expected. A woman alone claiming land was not unusual in the abstract, but it was unusual enough in practice that people had opinions. The women at the church, when she attended the following Sunday, were welcoming in the cautious way of people who have not yet decided what category a person belongs in. A few of the men were overtly skeptical, including a man named Harlan Good, who had apparently made an offer on Edmund's land to the county clerk before the rightful heir could be located, and who regarded Theodora's arrival with the specific hostility of someone whose plan has been disrupted. He was a broad, florid man who ran a cattle operation north of town, and who seemed to believe that the size of his operation entitled him to the deference of everyone around him. He found her at the general store on her 3rd week in Calla Springs and made what he called a business proposition, which was an offer to buy the land for a price that was insulting if she knew what she was doing and might have seemed reasonable if she did not. She knew what she was doing. She had spent 2 weeks with Roscoe Brenner learning the value of the water access alone. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary was the only reliable water source in a mile radius, and the land was worth considerably more than Harlan Good was offering. She told him no. She told him plainly and without apology that she intended to farm the land herself and that it was not for sale. Harlan Good looked at her the way men like him always looked at women who declined to be managed, with a particular mixture of incredulity and poorly concealed fury. He said something about a woman alone having a hard time of it out here. She said she had noted that some people seemed to find that prospect concerning for her welfare and others seemed to find it convenient for their own, and that she could tell the difference. Then she purchased her flour and cornmeal and left. Roscoe was waiting with the horses outside, holding both reins with the patient expression she had come to think of as his thinking face. She told him what had happened and he listened without interruption, and when she finished, he said simply that Harlan Good had been trying to acquire land along Garner Creek for 3 years and that he would likely try again. "Will he cause trouble?" she asked. Roscoe considered this with honest thought rather than false reassurance. "Probably some," he said. "He's the kind of man who considers persistence a virtue when it's applied to what he wants, but he also knows that making direct trouble for a woman who has legal documents in order is a different kind of trouble than he wants." He paused. "And I'm around." She looked at him. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Brenner." "I know that," he said, and the complete absence of argument in his voice told her he genuinely meant it. "I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just saying you don't have to." He mounted his horse with the easy, unthinking grace of a man who had been riding since before he could remember. "There's a difference." She thought about that distinction for a long time after they parted ways that evening. There was a difference. It was a difference she had not allowed herself to contemplate much in 4 years of managing alone, because the luxury of not having to manage alone had not been available to her. She sat on her porch in the evening watching the last light drain from the sky and thought about what it might mean to not have to. April moved into May with the particular generosity of a Texas spring that has decided to be kind. The wheat grew well. The cattle were healthy. Margaret the hog proved herself to be intelligent and troublesome in equal measure, escaping her pen twice in the first month and being retrieved both times with some difficulty. The porch step held firm. The cook stove, with its new gasket, drew beautifully, and the biscuits she made on a Saturday morning turned out so well she brought some to Roscoe's land and left them at his door because he was out in his fields, and she did not want to interrupt his work. He appeared at her door that evening with a look on his face that she could not fully interpret, holding the cloth she had wrapped them in, and said that those were the best biscuits he had eaten since his mother left for Louisiana, and that she had ruined him for all lesser biscuits. She told him that was a dramatic response to some flour and butter, and he said that sometimes dramatic responses were the accurate ones. They stood at her door in the soft May evening, and the light was golden, and the cottonwood trees were full and swaying gently, and she became aware in a sudden, unavoidable way that she was very glad he was there. Not because of the biscuits and not even because of the farming knowledge, though she was grateful for both. She was glad because of the particular quality of his company, which was warm and honest and present in a way that she had not experienced before from anyone who was not Edmund, and Edmund was gone. She thought about this later with some alarm, the way you think about something when you realize it has become significant before you gave it permission to do so. She had come here to claim a piece of land and build something out of grief. She had not come here to fall in love with a quiet, decent cowboy who slept in other people's barns out of pure fidelity to a dead man's hope. This was not part of any plan she had made, and yet here she was, standing in her kitchen the morning after the biscuit conversation, making a list that included the wheat and the fence and Margaret's pen, and one more item she did not write down but which occupied more of her thinking than the other items combined. Roscoe Brenner was not a man who said things easily. She had come to understand this about him. He was not cold, not by any measure. He was attentive and generous and funny in a dry, unhurried way that sometimes made her laugh out loud at things that had seemed serious a moment before. But he was careful with his words in the way of someone who had learned that words, once said, could not be retrieved, and so he chose them deliberately. This made it all the more significant when, in the middle of May, he said what he said. They had been working together mending a section of fence along the northern boundary of her property, a job that required two people to do properly and which they had been doing for most of the afternoon. She had learned to drive fence posts by then, something she had not expected to enjoy and found that she did with a fierce, satisfying energy. They had worked mostly in companionable silence with occasional practical exchanges, and then she had said something about Edmund, something small, a memory of him teaching her to fish in a creek near their parents' house when she was 8 years old and he was 13, and Roscoe had listened with that particular quality of attention. He had that made a person feel that what they were saying was the most important thing happening in the world at that moment. And then he said, "I'm glad you came, Theodora." He used her first name. He had called her Miss Sutton until this moment, always with a respectfulness that she had found both proper and, if she was honest, slightly aggravating in recent weeks because it maintained a distance she had begun to resent. The shift was small and enormous simultaneously. She kept her hands on the fence wire and did not look at him immediately. She needed a moment. "I'm glad I came too," she said. "I thought about writing you," he said, "after Edmund died. I thought about writing to let you know what had happened, and then I thought that it was not my place, and then the county clerk said he was handling notifications, and I told myself that was the right arrangement." He paused and she could hear him choosing the next words with great care. "But the truth is I was also afraid." She looked at him then. He was looking at the fence post, not at her, and his hands were steady on the wire. "Afraid of what?" she asked. "That if I wrote," he said, "and you wrote back and we began to know each other through letters, it would mean something that I didn't have the right to mean. You were a woman I hadn't met. You were Edmund's sister. You were going to arrive and need to be able to make clear decisions about your land, without a man who had been managing it in the meantime having built up some kind of claim on your attention through correspondence." He finally looked at her. "That didn't seem right to me. She stared at him for a long moment. "You were protecting my autonomy," she said slowly, "from your own feelings." Something shifted in his face at that. The careful expression softened. "I suppose I was," he said. She turned back to the fence and drove the next staple with considerable force. "That is," she said, "the most thoughtful and also the most irritating thing I have heard in recent memory." There was a pause, and then he laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and she felt it do something to the architecture of her chest. She laughed too, and they stood there by the fence in the May afternoon laughing about something that was also not entirely funny, and when the laughter settled into something quieter, she was still close enough to him that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "My name is Theodora," she said. "I know," he said. "You should use it," she said. "All right," he said. And the word carried so much that she thought she might have to sit down for a moment, but she didn't because there was still fence to be mended. June arrived, and with it the first real heat of the Texas summer, the kind of heat that is not cruel but is honest, that says to a person plainly, "This is what this country is, and you must decide if you are equal to it." Theodora decided she was. She had developed a routine by then, an early rising, a walk of the property before the heat built, work through the morning. A midday rest she had initially resisted, and now considered one of the finer aspects of life in Texas. Work again in the late afternoon when the heat backed off somewhat, and the evenings on the porch where, more often than not, Roscoe appeared. He had stopped inventing thin, legitimate reasons for his visits. He came because he came, and she was always glad when she heard his horse on the trail, and she thought he probably knew that by now. They talked in the evenings with the easy depth of two people who have found that the other one is interesting and keeps becoming more so. She told him about the boarding house in Abilene, about the particular indignity of managing other people's comfort while having none of her own, about her plans for the land that grew more specific every day as she learned it better. She wanted to put in a proper kitchen garden. She wanted to expand the chicken operation. She thought the south field, which was currently unused, might support sorghum. She had ideas, and she expressed them without apology, and he listened to all of them and offered his thoughts with the same directness she offered hers, which meant that sometimes they disagreed and worked through the disagreement with the brisk efficiency of two people who are more interested in finding the right answer than in being right themselves. He told her about the ranches he had worked on, the enormous cattle operations in South Texas, where a man could spend months without sleeping in the same place twice, the loneliness of that life that had eventually worn through the freedom of it. He told her about the piece of land he had bought here, 30 acres that he had worked into something functional and solvent, if not yet abundant, and the particular satisfaction of working land that was his and knowing that every improvement he made was an improvement that would endure. She asked him once if he was happy, the question coming out more simply than she intended, and he looked at the creek glinting in the evening light and said that happy was a complicated word, but that he was more content than he had been in a long time, and that lately he was something more than content, and the more was new and worth paying attention to. He did not look at her when he said this, but she was looking at him, and so she saw the slight tension in his jaw that said the words had cost him something. They had their first real argument in the middle of June, and it was about Harlan Good. Good had come by the property twice in May, the second time with a man she did not know who was apparently his lawyer, and Theodora had turned him away both times with complete legal clarity and no small amount of frost. But in early June, she found a section of her northern fence cut clean, which was not the work of cattle or weather, but of a blade, and one of her horses was missing for 2 days before being found 3 miles away on the edge of Good's range. She could not prove the connection, and she knew it. But she knew the connection existed as surely as she knew the difference between a fence that had weathered and a fence that had been cut. Roscoe arrived the morning she found the fence, and his expression, when she told him what she had found, was controlled in a way that told her he was working to keep it that way. He said he would ride out and speak with Good. She told him she would ride out with him. He said that was not necessary. She said that it absolutely was. He said he did not want her in a situation that might become difficult. She said that it was her land and her fence and her horse, and she would be there when the conversation happened or there would be no conversation to have. They stared at each other in the morning sun, both of them stubborn, both of them right in different ways, and the argument was real and edged, and she felt the heat of it in her throat. "I am not a woman who needs to be kept away from her own problems," she said. "I know that," he said, and his voice was tight. "Then why are you doing this?" He pushed his hat back on his head and looked at the cut fence rather than at her and said, "Because I do not entirely trust myself to have a reasonable conversation with Harlan Good about his behavior toward you. And having you there makes that harder, not because of your capability, but because of what I feel when someone treats you poorly." She was so surprised by this that she could not say anything for a moment. The anger in her throat subsided into something completely different. "That is not a reason for me to stay home," she said more gently. "No," he agreed, "it's not." They rode out together to Good's ranch, and Roscoe was, in the event, perfectly reasonable and precise, speaking with an authority that surprised even Theodora given how quiet he generally was in social situations. He made it clear, without accusation but with the direct confidence of a man who meant every syllable, that the land to the south of town along Garner Creek was legally and firmly in the possession of Miss Theodora Sutton, that any interference with that land's fences, livestock, or operations would be taken seriously, and that he personally guaranteed that it would be taken seriously. Good blustered and implied things without stating them outright, and in the end said nothing of consequence. They rode home. "You were good," she told him on the way back. "I wanted to be considerably less polite," he said. "I know," she said. "That was visible, was it?" "Only to me, I think." She paused. "Roscoe." He looked at her sidelong. "Thank you," she said. He looked ahead at the trail. "You're welcome, Theodora." Good did not bother her again in any direct way after that, though she heard through the small intelligence network of a small town that he was unhappy about it. She did not lose sleep over Harlan Good's unhappiness. She had other things to think about. She planted her kitchen garden in the last week of June, laying it out on the south side of the house where the morning light would be best, and spent several evenings working the soil in a way that was absorbing and satisfying, and also, she admitted to herself, something that made her think of roots in a way that was not entirely botanical. She thought about permanence. She thought about what Edmund had meant when he had said in his letter that the land would take care of her. She thought about what it meant to be taken care of, and what it meant to take care in return. On a Thursday evening in late June, when the sky was doing the particular extravagant performance of color that Texas skies seem to consider their birthright, Roscoe sat on her porch steps, and she sat in the porch chair, and they had been talking for 2 hours, and then they had been sitting in silence for some time, the easy silence of two people who have talked enough to be comfortable in the quiet together. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been coming here every day," he said, "and sometimes I tell myself there is a reason, and sometimes I give up pretending there is a reason, and either way I come. And I think you know why I come." He looked down at his hands, those capable, calloused hands. "But I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain speech." He looked up at her. "I have fallen in love with you, Theodora. I don't say that to alarm you or to make any demand of you. I say it because it's true and because you should know the truth of where I stand." The evening was very still. The cottonwood trees had stopped moving. The sky was orange and pink and deep blue at the edges, and the whole world seemed to be holding a breath along with her. "How long?" she asked. He thought about this with the seriousness he gave to important questions. "Since about the 4th day," he said. "You got in an argument with Margaret the hog, and you lost the argument, but you refused to acknowledge it and went back to what you were doing with complete dignity and tact. I thought that was about the finest thing I had seen." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with a steadiness that she understood was not easy, that had cost him something to establish and was costing him something to maintain. He was afraid, she realized, not of her exactly, but of what her answer would mean. For all his steadiness and competence, he was sitting on her porch steps in the long June evening genuinely uncertain of what she would say, and that vulnerability was so visible to her in that moment that it made something in her chest loosen entirely. "I have been falling in love with you," she said, "since the afternoon you replaced my porch step without being asked, and then refused to make anything significant of it." He was still for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, a slow change, like ground thawing after winter, the careful expression giving way to something full and unguarded and warm. He stood up from the step and she rose from the chair, and they were very close to each other in the rosy evening light, and when he reached up and touched her face with one rough, gentle hand, she leaned into it as naturally as a plant toward sunlight. "May I?" he began. "Yes," she said. He kissed her in the slow, deliberate way he did everything, and it was the best thing she had experienced in a very long time, perhaps the best thing she had experienced ever. He kissed her, and she held the front of his shirt in both hands, and the sky behind them went dark by degrees without either of them taking much notice. When they separated, she kept hold of his shirt. He kept his hand against her face. They looked at each other in the new dark with the small sounds of the property around them, the horses in the barn, the creek, the frogs that had started up at dusk, and she felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be in a way she had not felt since before her parents died, since the last time Edmund had been in the same room with her. "Edmund told me to trust you," she said softly. "I know," he said. "He told me to be patient." A pause. "He was a wise man." "He was," she said. "He was also extremely annoying." "Yes," Roscoe agreed. "That too." July in Texas was not for the faint of heart, and Theodora had decided early on that she was not faint of heart, so she and the Texas summer arrived at a mutual understanding. The wheat came to harvest in the first weeks of July, and this was a significant undertaking that required more than 2 people, and it was in the organization of the harvest that she first understood the texture of the small community she had moved into. Roscoe's neighbors from further east, a family named Callaway with 3 grown sons, came to help, as did a woman named Pearl Acaffer, who ran a small farm south of town with her husband James, and who arrived with food enough to feed twice the number of people present, and an expertise with the wheat that made Theodora deeply grateful. Pearl was a tall, direct woman of about 35 who had been farming in Texas for 6 years, and who gave Theodora information about the county's agricultural rhythms, with the efficient generosity of someone who believed that other people succeeding was not a threat to her own success. Theodora liked her enormously and immediately. They worked for 3 days, and on the 3rd evening there was a meal laid out on tables made of boards and sawhorses in the barn yard, and lanterns hung in the trees, and someone had brought a fiddle, and the whole thing had a warmth to it that she had not expected, the particular warmth of people who work hard in difficult country and who celebrate the completion of hard work with the full attention it deserves. Roscoe found her standing at the edge of the lamplight watching the dancing, and he stood beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, and when she looked up at him, his face was illuminated gold and happy in the lantern light. "This was your land," she said quietly. "You planted this wheat." "No," he said. "The wheat is yours. I just kept it company until you arrived." She took his hand where it hung between them, and his fingers closed around hers with immediate, certain warmth. They stood there watching the dancing, and after a while he led her out into the middle of it, and they danced with the awkward, laughing earnestness of 2 people who are not particularly skilled dancers but who are very glad to be dancing together. Pearl Acaffer caught her eye from across the firelight and smiled at her with knowing warmth, and Theodora smiled back. August was hard and hot and requiring, and she met it full on. She had stopped thinking of the land as Edmund's, or as a debt she owed him, or as something she was managing, until she could decide what she really wanted. She thought of it as hers in the full, rooted sense, thought of the soil under her boots as something she knew personally, thought of July, and August the horses with the particular affection of someone who has fed and tended animals long enough to be trusted by them. She sent a letter to Mr. Peavy at the county clerk's office, confirming that she was in permanent residence on the property, and requesting the full deed documentation be updated accordingly. She sent a letter to a woman she had known at the boarding house in Abilene, the only one she had been genuinely friends with, and told her she was staying in Texas and was unexpectedly, bewilderingly, thoroughly happy. She and Roscoe had settled into something that was not yet named but was deeply comfortable in its dailiness. He came every day, sometimes for work and sometimes not, and stayed for meals more often than not. And there were evenings when they sat on the porch long after dark talking, and evenings when they sat in easy silence, and evenings when he stayed so late. The moon had moved considerably across the sky before he finally rode home. He had mended her porch, replaced a rotting board in the barn roof, helped her restructure the chicken enclosure, advised on the sorghum in the south field and helped her plant it, and somehow done all of this without ever making her feel as though his help diminished her authority over the property. It was a balance she had not experienced before in any relationship with any man, and she valued it with a quiet, fierce gratitude. Pearl Acafer came by in the middle of August with a cutting from an apple tree she had brought from the east 3 years ago and was propagating, saying she thought Theodora might want it for the kitchen garden. And while she was there, she sat on the porch and drank coffee with Theodora and said, in the straightforward manner that characterized everything she said, "Roscoe Brenner has been a single, private man for as long as anyone in this county has known him. And the fact that he is over here every day with his sleeves rolled up is something people have noticed." "Have they?" Theodora said. "And the look on his face when he's here," Pearl continued, "is something different from the look on a man's face when he is just being neighborly." Theodora said nothing and kept her expression calm and felt warmth moving up the back of her neck. "I just want to say," Pearl said, "that I am glad for you both. This is a hard country and it is much better with the right person in it." Theodora looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the south field where the sorghum was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing, and she thought about Edmund's letter and his instructions to trust and his description of a place where a person could breathe all the way down to their boots. "It is," she said. "It really is." One September evening, nearly a year to the month after Edmund had died, Theodora went down to the creek at the end of the day and sat with her feet in the water and thought about her brother. She did this sometimes when the thinking needed to be done in quiet, away from the house and all its tasks. The creek was lower in September than it had been in spring, but it was still running clear and cold over the smooth stones, and the cottonwoods above her were just beginning to show the first pale gold of autumn. She heard Roscoe's horse and then his footsteps and was not surprised when he sat down beside her on the bank, boots still on because he had not spent the afternoon hoeing and did not have her particular need to feel the water. He did not speak immediately, reading her mood with the accuracy he had developed over months of paying attention. "I've been thinking about him," she said. "I know," he said. "I think he would like this," she said. "How it has gone. The land and the harvest and the neighbors, you." She paused. "He would probably be insufferable about you, actually. He would take enormous credit for the whole thing." "He should get some credit," Roscoe said. "He's the one who asked me to watch the land." "You didn't have to." "No," he said, "but I was glad to." He was quiet for a moment. "Theodora, there is something I want to ask you." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek, elbows on his knees, hat off, the fading light on his face. He looked both completely calm and completely terrified, which was an expression she had come to find profoundly endearing. "I want to ask if you would marry me," he said. "I am not asking because I think it is the logical next step, or because I want a practical arrangement. I am asking because I love you and because this last year, which has had difficult parts and good parts and surprising parts, has been the best year of my life, and I would like every subsequent year to also have you in it." He looked at her then. "I would like to be the person who is here with you." She looked at him in the September light, this man who had planted her wheat without knowing why, who had slept in her barn and kept her fences and mended her step, and learned to like Margaret the hog with approximately the same resigned affection that she had. This man who had protected her autonomy before they met and who had never once in all the months since made her feel that her competence was anything other than one of her finest qualities. "I would like that too," she said. He let out a breath that she suspected he had been holding for quite some time. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "Roscoe, yes." He took her hands in both of his and held them and looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that she had come to understand was his heart showing, the expression he did not show to very many people, and which she understood to be an enormous trust. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat by Garner Creek in the first gold of autumn, and the water moved over the stones, and the evening was large and quiet around them, and she thought that Edmund had been exactly right. They were married in November, in the small white church in Calla Springs that was still peeling, but which someone had made an effort to repaint on the side that faced the street. Reverend Holt, a wiry man of 60 who had been performing marriages in Hayes County for 20 years, and who had developed a ceremony that was dignified without being elaborate, married them on a bright, cool morning with the whole congregation present, because, in a town of Calla Springs' size, the whole congregation was also most of the town. Pearl and James Ockhaffer sat in the front pew. The Callaway family took up an entire row. Mr. Peavy was there with his wife, who had apparently decided that Theodora was an acceptable addition to the county. Once she had demonstrated, she intended to stay and farm. Even the woman at the general store, who had been suspicious of Theodora in the early weeks, came and brought a pot of preserves as a gift. Theodora wore a dark blue dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in a nearby town, because she was not a woman who denied herself the pleasure of a proper dress for her own wedding. Her hair was up, and she wore the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, the only piece of jewelry she had ever owned. She walked up the aisle of the small church without anyone to give her away because she was giving herself, which was, she felt, the more accurate description of what was happening. Roscoe stood at the front of the church in a dark jacket she had not seen before, and a white shirt, and a string tie and his best boots, which were considerably better than his working boots. And when she came down the aisle and he saw her, the expression on his face was the kind of expression that required no words, and that she would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. They said their vows in the plain, clear language of the ceremony, and then in the plainer, clearer language they had been speaking to each other for 8 months. And when Reverend Holt said what ministers say at the conclusion of such things and Roscoe kissed her, the small congregation of Calla Springs expressed itself with the enthusiastic warmth of people who had watched two genuinely decent human beings find each other in a hard and beautiful country and were glad about it. Pearl cried. She denied this vigorously afterward. Everyone had seen her. The reception was at the Callaway farm, which was the largest property in the immediate area, with tables in the yard and food contributed by a dozen households, and the fiddle player from the harvest dance, who had apparently made himself a fixture at community events. Theodora danced with her husband until her feet ached and then kept dancing, and Roscoe was still not a skilled dancer, but he was a willing one, and he held her with a care and surety that made technical skill irrelevant. Later, when the fires were burning low and the guests were drifting toward home in the cool November dark, she stood with him near the edge of the firelight and looked up at the enormous Texas sky, which was doing its best work in the cold, clear air, stars scattered from one horizon to the other. "Your brother would have been here," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "He would have been extremely emotional about it and pretended he wasn't and made at least one speech that went on too long." Roscoe's chest moved against her shoulder with what she recognized as suppressed laughter. "That sounds accurate," he said. "He would have loved you," she said. "He already did, I think, from what he wrote about you in his letter. He knew what kind of man you were. "He was a good judge of character," Roscoe said. "He was," she said. "In most things." She turned to look up at him. "He was not good at taking care of himself." "No," Roscoe agreed. "You are," she said, "better at it than he was, I have noticed." He looked at her steadily. "I have more reason to now," he said. She took his arm and they walked toward the horses in the dark, toward the property along Garner Creek that was hers and his together now, toward the small house where Edmund's things were still on the shelf and always would be, toward the life that had grown up around a dead man's hope and a living man's faithfulness, and a woman who had arrived with a carpet bag and a broken heart, and had found something she had not known she was looking for. The first winter of their marriage was cold by Texas standards and beautiful by any measure. They moved Roscoe's remaining things from his own land to the Sutton property, which was larger and had better water access, and Roscoe's 30 acres were leased to the Callaway boys, an arrangement that suited everyone and added to the income with which they could improve the main property. They winterized the barn together, re-insulated the house, put up preserves in quantities that Theodora found deeply satisfying to look at on the pantry shelf. They read in the evenings, she with the almanac and agricultural catalogs she had sent for, he with whatever books she acquired from the small lending library that the church had organized. And they talked about the books and argued about the almanac's projections, and sat close together by the fire because the house was warm enough, but proximity was better than warmth alone. She wrote to the woman from the boarding house in Abilene and described her life with the particular precision of a person who wants someone to understand, not just to congratulate. She described the land and the creek and the sorghum and the chickens and Margaret, who had become an institution. She described Roscoe with the care she took with everything that mattered, with attention to the things that were true rather than the things that sounded impressive. And she wrote that she was happy in a way she did not entirely have vocabulary for, and so she simply reported it as a fact. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Roscoe on a March morning while they were eating breakfast, simply and directly because they had always communicated simply and directly, and his response was to set down his coffee cup with great deliberateness and look at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was joy in its purest, most uncomplicated form. And then to come around the table and take her face in both hands and kiss her forehead and her face, and then simply hold her for a long time without saying anything. "Well," he said finally, against her hair. "Well," she agreed. He was, through the months that followed, attentive without being overbearing, solicitous about her comfort without treating her as though she had suddenly become incapable. He took on more of the heavy physical work without announcement and without making her feel managed. When she had difficult mornings in the early months, he was there with tea and crackers and the steady, quiet presence that had first made her trust him, and when she felt well and wanted to work, he worked alongside her without argument. Pearl Acafer became her closest source of practical knowledge, having had 3 children herself, and the two women developed the kind of friendship that is built on mutual respect and frank conversation, the kind that lasts. The summer of 1884 was hot in the way that Texas summers are obliged to be, and Theodora was large and uncomfortable in July and August in a way she had expected to find more difficult than she did. There was something about the heat and the discomfort and the vivid physicality of it that she found herself accepting with the same direct pragmatism she applied to everything. This was her body doing something enormous, and she was going to be present for it fully. The baby was born on the 12th of September, 1884, a boy, in the house along Garner Creek with Pearl Acafer and the town's doctor, a tired but competent man named Dr. Marsh, in attendance. It was a long labor and a difficult night, and Roscoe was outside on the porch for most of it, which Dr. Marsh required as a matter of professional preference, and she could hear him pacing and was, at certain points in the proceedings, grimly amused by this. When Dr. Marsh came to the porch and told him he had a son, and that Theodora was well, Roscoe did not hear the second part first because the second part was the important one, and he had to ask twice before he absorbed the information that she was well. And then he went in and sat beside her on the bed, and held the small, furious, determined-looking person they had made together. And Theodora watched his face in the lamplight, and felt that she had never in her life been so completely in the right place. "Edmund," Roscoe said quietly, not asking exactly. "Edmund James Brenner," she said. James for Roscoe's father, which she had suggested, and which had made him look at her with the kind of gratitude that goes deeper than words. He looked down at the baby, who had calmed somewhat, and was now looking at the general vicinity of his father's face with the unfocused but attentive expression of someone who is already paying attention. "Hello, Edmund," Roscoe said. Pearl came in some time later with coffee and stood in the doorway looking at the three of them, and she said nothing for a moment and then said, "Edmund would have been so insufferable about this." Theodora laughed, which hurt, and said, "Exactly what I thought." Edmund James Brenner grew into a solid, cheerful child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's complete indifference to being managed by anyone, a combination that was both exhausting and magnificent. By the time he was walking reliably, Theodora's kitchen garden had expanded into something that could genuinely be called a proper garden, and the sorghum field had established itself as a reliable crop, and Margaret the hog had produced 2 generations of offspring and was still occupying her pen with undiminished authority. The land along Garner Creek in the spring of 1885 looked like a place where people had been working and loving and building for years, which it was. The house had a new room added on the south side, built by Roscoe and the Callaway boys over the course of a month in the autumn of 1884, in anticipation of the baby and future needs. The barn had been properly repaired and expanded. The fence lines were straight and solid. There were 2 new horses, younger than July and August, and the cattle operation had grown to 8 head. The chickens were thriving in a way that Theodora found disproportionately satisfying. Calla Springs had grown somewhat too, a new doctor's office separate from the hotel, a better schoolhouse, a second general store. The school was a matter Theodora had opinions about, having attended and then been denied an extended formal education herself, and she became one of the people most actively involved in the school committee, arguing for a longer school year and a broader curriculum with the same direct competence she brought to everything. Pearl Acaffer was on the same committee, and they were, combined, somewhat formidable. The school year was extended. Roscoe watched her argue at community meetings with what she recognized as the particular expression of someone who admires something they already knew was admirable. He never tried to moderate her or to soften her positions for social comfort. He told her once, on the way home from a meeting at which she had rather forcefully changed the direction of the conversation about teachers' wages, that she was the most effective person he had ever seen in a room, and that he meant that as the compliment it was. She told him that the wages issue was obvious, and she could not understand why it required her to make it obvious for it to be seen. He said that most things worth fighting for required someone to make them obvious, and that he was grateful she was a person who did that. She held his hand on the drive home and thought, not for the first time, that she was married to a man who was on her side in every way that mattered, and that this was not a small thing. It was, in fact, an enormous thing that she did not intend to take lightly. In the spring of 1886, she found she was expecting again. Edmund James was 18 months old and walking and talking with considerable ambition in both departments, and the idea of another child was both daunting and welcome. The second labor in November of that year was shorter than the first, which Theodora was frankly relieved about, and produced a daughter they named Clara Rose, the Rose for no one in particular, but because it was the name that felt right when Theodora held her and Roscoe suggested it, and she agreed. Edmund, now 2 years old, regarded his sister with a long, considering look when he was first introduced to her, and then reached out one small, careful hand and touched her face with a gentleness that made both his parents very still for a moment. He said, "Baby," with great authority, and Theodora said yes, that was right, and Roscoe picked up his son and held him and looked at his daughter and his wife, and made an expression that Theodora privately catalogued as the single most content she had ever seen him look. Their life on the Garner Creek property in those years had the quality of something built with intention and tended with care. It was not easy, because farming in Texas in the 1880s was not easy, because water rights were contested and markets were uncertain, and the weather was a force of nature with no particular interest in a family's plans. There were dry years and wet years, and a particularly difficult summer when the cattle got sick, and they lost 2 animals, and had to make hard calculations about the rest of the season. There were disagreements, real ones, about finances and decisions and the direction of things, and they had them with the directness they applied to everything, which meant they were sometimes sharp and always honest and resolved, because they were 2 people who were fundamentally interested in the same things. What they were fundamentally interested in was this: the land, the children, each other. In that order or in any order, all 3 equally essential. Harlan Good sold his operation north of town in 1887 to a younger man who was, by all accounts, less interested in acquiring his neighbor's property and more interested in running his own business efficiently, and the particular tension that had underlined Theodora's first year in Calla Springs finally resolved. She did not think about Good much after that. She had other things to think about. Edmund and Clara grew as children grow in a place they are rooted in, with the particular confidence of children who have always known where home is. Edmund was his mother in temperament, direct and certain, and his father in manner, quiet and steady, a combination that made him both easy to be with and surprisingly difficult to argue with for a person who was, in 1889, only 5 years old. Clara was a different creature entirely, more observant, more given to long silences followed by unexpected and accurate pronouncements, already showing a fascination with the plant life in her mother's garden that Theodora encouraged with the same enthusiasm that Pearl Acaffer had encouraged hers. Theodora turned 30 in the spring of 1889, and Roscoe marked this with a care that was characteristic of him. He did not make a large occasion of it, because he knew her well enough to know she did not require spectacle. He made a small occasion of it, just the family and Pearl and James and their children and the Callaway family at a supper that was better than usual, and he gave her a gift that he had clearly been planning for some time. A complete set of agricultural reference books, the most current available, and a small, framed piece of paper that turned out to be a certificate from the County Agricultural Extension Office, which had recently been established, confirming her registration as a farming operator in Hayes County. He had registered her formally in her own right, not as his wife but as herself, as a woman who ran a farm in Texas, because he knew that this was how she thought of herself and he wanted the official record to reflect it. She held the certificate for a long time and then set it on the shelf next to Edmund's tin box, where it remained. 30, she said. 30, he agreed. He was 34 himself, which was still a young man, though he sometimes moved in the morning with the slight stiffness of someone whose body knew it had been working hard for a decade and a half. She had noticed this and had said nothing particular about it, only that she had begun making a particularly good liniment from a recipe Pearl's grandmother had passed down, and that there was always some on the shelf. Edmund would be 34, she said. He had been in recent months in her thoughts more often, not with grief exactly, but with the particular love of someone permanently absent, the kind of presence that does not diminish but changes form. Yes, Roscoe said. He would have 6 children by now and would be completely chaotic about all of them, she said. Roscoe smiled. That does sound like him. She looked around the supper table at her children and her friends and her husband in the lamplight, at the room that was clean and warm and full of the particular texture of a life well occupied, at the window beyond which the Garner Creek property lay in the spring evening, the kitchen garden and the fields and the barn and the cottonwoods. She thought about the carpet bag and the $40 and the letter from a county clerk that had upended everything she knew. She thought about a man she had never heard of who had planted her wheat and mended her fences and slept in her barn for 7 months without knowing why, except that decency had required it, and decency was simply who he was. She thought about arriving at the top of that rise and seeing the land spread out below her, worked and tended and alive, and then the figure moving near the barn with that purposeful, unhurried stride. She thought about the first conversation in the warm afternoon, and the hammer set down on the fence post with such deliberate care, and the pot of stew left on the porch railing, and the biscuits, and the September evening on the bank of the creek, and the small white church in November, and every morning and evening in between and since. She reached across the table and took Roscoe's hand where it rested near his plate. He turned it over and held hers with the same certain warmth as the very first time, unchanged by 5 years or any number of hard mornings and good evenings. He did not look up from the conversation he was having with James Ockafer about the coming season's crop prospects. He simply held her hand, because she was there and he knew she was there, and that was the whole of it. Outside, the Texas evening was doing what Texas evenings did, pouring color across the sky in quantities that seemed almost irresponsible, the kind of beauty that demanded a person's full attention at least once a day. Through the window she could see the last of the light on the fields, the good dark soil, the fence lined straight as promises, the creek glinting silver through the trees. Edmund had been right about all of it. It was a place where a person could breathe all the way down to their boots. She breathed now, fully and without reservation, in the house along Garner Creek with her husband's hand in hers, and her children's voices filling the room and her friend laughing at something at the end of the table, and the spring evening holding everything gently and completely. She had arrived to claim a piece of land. She had found a man who had been farming it for her without knowing why, out of some uncomplicated faithfulness to a dead man's love for his sister, and to the simple idea that something worth having should be taken care of until its rightful person arrived. She had found, also, a country that asked everything and gave back exactly as much as you brought to it. She had found neighbors who became family and a community that was rough-edged and real and worth fighting for. She had found, inside her grief, a garden. She had found, inside a stranger's decency, a love. The sorghum would need attention in a week, and there were repairs to make to the east fence before summer, and Edmund was going to be a terror about the new foal that July had delivered in March, and Clara had a plan for the kitchen garden that required more seeds than they currently had and would need to be ordered. There were letters to write and accounts to balance and a school committee meeting in 2 weeks and 100 daily ordinary things that were also, she had come to understand, exactly the substance of which a full life was composed. She was going to do all of it. She was going to do all of it right here, on this 42 acres along Garner Creek, in this hard and beautiful country with this quiet and extraordinary man. She looked at Roscoe's profile in the lamplight as he laughed at something James had said, and felt the love she had for him as a steady, root-deep, unremarkable and astonishing thing. Outside, the last light left the sky. The stars came in over Texas, the same stars that had looked down on everything this land had ever held, the same stars Edmund had watched from this porch in the evenings before he was too sick to sit outside, the same stars that had watched a woman ride down a rise toward a man with a hammer and changed 2 lives in the process. The creek ran over its stones in the dark. The horses breathed in the barn. The kitchen garden held the day's warmth in its soil. Theodora Sutton Brenner, 25 years a woman and 5 years a wife, and always a person who faced what was in front of her, looked out the window at the enormous and generous night, felt her husband's hand in hers, and was, in the most complete and unequivocal way she knew, home.